In this video, we uncover Ohio's most notorious female killers, revealing chilling stories of betrayal, murder, and cold-blooded crimes. These haunting cases expose the dark side of human nature and prove that evil has no gender. Dive into their motives, actions, and the lasting impact. Viewer discretion is advised. 1. Kimberly S. Anderson. In the quiet town of Wapakoneta, Ohio, where cornfields stretch for miles and life moves at a gentle pace, a single phone call shattered the silence one Labor Day weekend. On September 2, 2001, Kimberly Anderson dialed 911 with a chilling confession she had shot her husband. Kimberly, a 37-year-old respiratory therapist and mother of 4, was known for her grace, intelligence, and ambition. By her mid-30s, she had already built a comfortable life, twice married with 2 children from each union. Her second husband, Brent Anderson, was a well-known divorce attorney from nearby Salina, successful, charismatic, and soon to be her legal adversary. Their 3-year marriage had deteriorated quickly. By October of 2000, Brent had filed for divorce, triggering a bitter custody dispute that consumed the months to follow. Then, just days before the divorce was to be finalized, Kimberly made her move. She claimed Brent had molested one of their young sons. She said she confronted him, and that's when he snapped, lunging at her in rage. She grabbed a handgun and fired. By the time police arrived, Brent Anderson was dead, shot 8 times, his body slumped in a walk-in closet. Kimberly never denied pulling the trigger. Her defense was simple but powerful: self-defense. She said she feared for her life and for the lives of her children. But prosecutors weren't convinced. They pointed to the lack of any prior claims of abuse during the divorce proceedings. They highlighted that Kimberly had both a phone and a loaded gun, and chose the latter. The shooting, they argued, was premeditated, cold, calculated. The courtroom became a battleground of conflicting narratives. Kimberly's team painted a portrait of a mother protecting her children from a dangerous man. Prosecutors, backed by Brent's family, argued it was a story driven more by emotion than evidence. After 7 tense days of testimony and just hours of deliberation, the jury returned a stunning verdict: not guilty on all counts. Kimberly Anderson walked free. Outside the courtroom, the reaction was anything but unanimous. Brent's family, devastated, filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit. This time, the outcome was different. A separate jury found Kimberly liable for Brent's death and ordered her to pay over $500,000 to his family. Still, Kimberly kept custody of her children and quietly resumed life in Wapakoneta. She later said, "There are no winners here. I loved Brent, too. I never meant to take his life, I just meant to stop him from taking ours." Was it a case of a mother pushed too far, or a tragedy fueled by suspicion and desperation? To this day, questions linger. Some believe justice was served in the criminal court. Others say the truth was buried alongside Brent Anderson. In the shadows of this small-town tragedy lies a haunting reminder. In some cases, the line between victim and perpetrator is as thin and fragile as trust itself. 2. Chynna P. Arnold. In the late summer of 2005, a quiet Dayton, Ohio neighborhood became the unlikely backdrop to one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. Chynna Arnold, 25 years old at the time, was a mother of 4. Friends described her as calm, soft-spoken, and at times troubled. Her past included prior convictions for abduction and forgery, signs of instability perhaps, but nothing that hinted at what was to come. On August 30th, Chynna walked into a local hospital, carrying her 28-day-old daughter, Paris. The baby was unresponsive. Medical staff rushed to help, but it was too late. The injuries, subtle on the outside, pointed to a cause no one could have imagined. At first, no one suspected foul play. Chynna told doctors she didn't know what happened. But as investigators pieced together evidence, a chilling possibility began to emerge. According to prosecutors, the night before, Arnold had argued with her boyfriend, Terrell Talley. The fight centered around Paris's paternity. China, allegedly intoxicated, was left alone with the baby, while her other children slept upstairs. By the time the truth unraveled, it was almost too surreal to believe. Authorities concluded that baby Paris had been placed inside a microwave and exposed to intense heat for what experts estimated was more than 2 minutes. The internal injuries were consistent with fatal thermal trauma. It was a crime that defied understanding. China Arnold was arrested in November 2006, over a year after Paris's death. Her initial release due to lack of evidence gave way to a high-profile trial in 2008. But just as the proceedings began, a child witness came forward claiming he had seen another boy put the baby in the microwave. The result was a mistrial. A second trial followed in 2008, and this time the narrative shifted. The new witness was found not to have been present at the time of the incident. Another witness, Arnold's former cellmate, testified that Arnold confessed during their time together in jail. Arnold was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life without parole. But the case was far from over. In 2010, the conviction was overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct. A third trial began the following year. Once again, the defense argued that Arnold was too intoxicated to act with intent, and that others may have been responsible. But the jury wasn't convinced. On May 13, 2011, China Arnold was convicted for a second time. A week later, the jury recommended life in prison. The judge agreed. China Arnold would never walk free again. To this day, China Arnold maintains her innocence. Her attorneys continue to pursue appeals, and her family insists she was wrongly accused. But for 2 separate juries, the evidence was clear. The case of China. Arnold leaves behind a lasting question, one that haunts the justice system, and every person who hears it. What drives a parent to commit the unthinkable? Sometimes the answers are buried not just in evidence, but in silence. 3. Asuncion, Villa. In late August 2009, a small city in southwest Ohio woke to headlines that stunned even seasoned investigators. A 35-day-old infant missing under suspicious circumstances. A mother with a troubling past. And beneath it all, a secret no one could have imagined. Her name was Asuncion Villa, known by many as Susie. Just 26 at the time, she lived in Hamilton, Butler County, with her children in a modest apartment complex. Neighbors described her as quiet, but rumors swirled about her parenting and unstable behavior. Susie had 4 children, but it was the youngest, Israel Santos, who would become the center of a tragic and complex case. On August 24th, Susie called 911, claiming her ex-boyfriend had taken Israel and never returned. What followed was a frantic search. But within hours, that story began to unravel. Detectives noticed inconsistencies in her account. Her affect was oddly flat. Her emotions felt forced. And then she failed a polygraph test. The next day, police made a grim discovery. In a garbage can behind Susie's apartment, they found the body of baby Israel wrapped in a plastic bag hidden among the refuse. He had died from a severe skull fracture, consistent with blunt force trauma. The coroner ruled it a homicide. The motive investigators uncovered a disturbing truth. Susie had been involved in a sexual relationship with a 15-year-old boy, Israel's biological father. Days after the baby's death, she was scheduled to appear at a county welfare office where she would have been required to disclose the father's identity for a routine paternity screening. Authorities allege she feared that revealing the father's age would expose the illegal relationship and potentially lead to charges, custody loss, and a cutoff of public benefits. Rather than face those consequences, prosecutors say Susie took the most drastic action imaginable. In 2011, Susie Avila pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including aggravated murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. She accepted a plea deal avoiding the death penalty, but receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. In court, she wept. She addressed her family saying, "Even if I am in prison, I can still be their mother. I hope when they grow up they will understand and wouldn't judge me." Her children, now raised by her sisters, have been shielded from the full scope of the tragedy. Psychological evaluations cited a history of mental health struggles, bipolar disorder, chronic depression, but nothing that absolved her actions. As one detective put it, her behavior wasn't that of a grieving mother. It was that of someone trying to conceal the truth. The case of Asuncion Avila is more than a story of a crime. It's a warning. About secrecy, about the devastating impact of untreated mental illness, and about how fear, when left unchecked, can spiral into something far darker. Today, Susie remains incarcerated in Ohio, serving a life sentence. The scars of her actions linger not only in court records, but in the quiet lives of the children she left behind. Some stories offer answers. Others leave only questions. 4. Debra Denise Brown. In the summer of 1984, a wave of fear swept across the Midwest. A man and a woman traveling by footbike and stolen car left a trail of terror stretching across 6 states. Their crimes were calculated, cruel, and seemingly without motive. At the center of it all was Debra Denise Brown. Born in 1962 in Waukegan, Illinois, Brown's early life was marked by instability. One of 11 children, she was reportedly quiet and withdrawn. Diagnosed with borderline intellectual functioning, she suffered head trauma as a child and was later described as having a dependent personality traits that would come to define the disturbing path she would follow. In 1983, Brown met Alton Coleman, a convicted sex offender with a long history of violent behavior. Within months, she ended her engagement to another man and left her family behind to be with him. What followed was not just a toxic relationship, but a deadly partnership. From May to July 1984, Coleman and Brown embarked on a brutal crime spree across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Kentucky. Their pattern was chilling. They would befriend strangers, gain trust, and then turn on them. Their victims ranged in age from young children to the elderly. All were African American, although investigators believed that was more a matter of camouflage than motive. The spree began with the abduction and murder of 9-year-old Vernita Wheat in Wisconsin. From there, the duo struck repeatedly, kidnapping, assaulting, and murdering as they moved from town to town. Among their victims, 7-year-old Tamika Turks and her sister Annie, who were lured into the woods in Indiana. Only Annie survived. Days later, 25-year-old Donna Williams was found strangled in Detroit. In Ohio, the bodies of Virginia Temple and her daughter Rochelle were discovered in a crawl space. Then came 15-year-old Tawny Story, 44-year-old Marlene Walters, and finally, a 77-year-old man, all murdered within weeks. The FBI placed Alton Coleman on its 10 most wanted list. The net was closing in. On July 20, 1984, police in Evanston, Illinois, spotted Coleman and Brown in a local park. They had been changing clothes every few blocks to avoid detection. When arrested, Brown was carrying a handgun. Coleman had a knife hidden in his socks. Their killing spree was finally over. What followed was a legal odyssey. Multiple states wanted to prosecute. Ohio went first. Both were sentenced to death for the murders of Marlene Walters and Tawny Story. During her trial, Brown shocked the courtroom by sending a note to the judge stating, "I killed the expletive, and I don't give a damn." I had fun out of it." She was later tried and sentenced to death again in Indiana. But in 1991, as Ohio's governor prepared to leave office, he commuted Brown's death sentence to life without parole, citing her low IQ and psychological dependence on Coleman. She remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Coleman, however, was executed in 2002. Was Deborah Brown a willing accomplice or a manipulated follower? A lost soul drawn into darkness, or something far more dangerous? To this day, the question lingers, and the echoes of a summer of terror remain. 5. Betty Butler. On a warm day in early September 1952, at Sharon Woods Park near Cincinnati, witnessed by fishermen and families, Betty Butler, 24, and her companion, Evelyn Clark, 35, were seen together near the lake. What began as a fishing outing quickly turned dark. Accounts report that Evelyn made what Betty described as unwanted advances. According to Butler's later admission and multiple eyewitness reports, Betty used a handkerchief to strangle Evelyn into unconsciousness, then dragged her into the lake and held her submersed until Evelyn sank beneath the surface. Police arrived swiftly. Betty did not deny the killing and claimed it was self-defense. She insisted Evelyn's behavior left her no choice. Others described the murder as driven by jealousy and rage, possibly tied to social taboos of same-sex relationships at the time. Some evidence suggested Betty identified as bisexual, and that Evelyn's attention toward another woman may have inflamed her fury. The killing witnessed in public led to her arrest within hours. At her trial in Hamilton County, the case against Betty was decisive. Eyewitness testimony, forensic detail, and her own statements left little room for doubt. Her defense of self-defense was overshadowed by the nature of the assault, a witnessed strangulation and drowning. The jury convicted her of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to death under Ohio law. Betty appealed and petitioned for clemency between late 1953 and early 1954, citing mental strain and limited emotion, but her requests were denied. On June 11, 1954, she became the only woman ever executed by the state of Ohio, and the last woman put to death by electrocution there. Witnesses described Betty entering the execution chamber calmly, wearing a pink and black print dress, white Oxford shoes, and bobby socks, clutching a rosary, a detail that underlined her serene composure. Until the end. Her last meal was surprisingly ordinary: scrambled eggs with cheese, toast, 2 glasses of milk, and apricots. During her time on death row, she reportedly studied religion and practiced charcoal drawing, though she remained polite but never friendly, carrying an air of detached reserve. Betty never expressed public remorse beyond claiming self-defense. Some accounts relate a whispered final phrase, "I never meant to kill her." Whether it reflected remorse or denial remains unclear or perhaps irreconcilable. Her case raises lingering questions. Was this act born of panic, jealousy, or perceived threat? Was it violence enacted in self-defense, or expression of buried rage, the sobriquet? The Sphinx evokes both mystery and emotional inscrutability, capturing her impenetrable demeanor and the chilling silence around her final confession. Decades later, Butler is remembered primarily as the last woman executed in Ohio, a case haunting in its rarity and the absence of clear motive. It also stands as a cautionary tale about how jealousy, denied emotion, and suppressed identity can erupt into tragedy. Betty Butler did not flee the justice system, but in attempting to claim self-defense, she left behind a story where control and chaos remain indistinguishable. 6. Marianne K. Colby. Marianne Colby was a 40-year-old housewife living in the quiet suburb of Shaker Heights, Ohio. To neighbors, she seemed like a typical homemaker, married to an aerospace engineer raising a young son. But behind closed doors, her mind was quietly unraveling. In 1952, Marianne developed an obsessive fixation on a man named John Young. Despite his clear rejection, she convinced herself that he returned her feelings. She followed him, called him repeatedly, even disrupted his dates. Eventually, John had to call Marianne's husband, Robert, asking him to step in. Marianne backed off, at least on the surface. 6 years later, fate brought them uncomfortably close again. The Young family moved just 2 doors down from the Colbys. Their sons, Creamer Young and Dane Colby, became friends. But the Youngs grew uneasy about the relationship. They felt Dane was a bad influence, and they began to distance their son. The Colbys noticed, and the tension between the families quietly grew. On the morning of August 24, 1965, Marianne called the Young household. She told John that she believed Creamer had left a jacket at her home. Trusting the neighbor, John sent his son over to retrieve it. Creamer never came back. Hours passed. The Youngs assumed their son was playing with Dane, but by noon, their worry turned to dread. That same day, a college student walking his dogs in a wooded area 10 miles away discovered the body of a young boy. The camp label on his sneakers read, "Creamer the Lion." It was him. Police began investigating, and Marianne's story quickly began to change. First, she claimed her son Dane had accidentally shot Creamer while playing. But forensic tests showed Dane couldn't have fired the gun, it required too much force. Confronted with this, Marianne said she had picked up the weapon by accident while gathering laundry, causing it to go off. But powder burns showed the shot had been fired at close range, just inches from the back of Creamer's head. Marianne had in fact shot the boy deliberately. Afterward, she wrapped his body, drove him to a secluded spot in the woods, and left him there. Then she returned home and hid the murder weapon inside 3 pounds of ground beef in her freezer. Authorities believed she was trying to mislead the investigation. She made calls to police, attempting to shift suspicion toward neighbors. Prosecutors argued she had planned the crime carefully, buying the pistol years earlier under a false name and luring Creamer to her home under false pretenses. But the case took a different turn in court. Marianne's defense rested on her mental state. Psychologists and psychiatrists testified that she suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. They described her as delusional, emotionally detached, and unable to distinguish right from wrong. Even the state's own experts couldn't deny signs of serious mental illness. Ultimately, the court agreed. On March 25, 1966, Marianne Colby was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to the Lima State Hospital for the criminally insane. She remained there for less than 4 years. In 1971, a judge ruled that she was sane and unlawfully detained. Marianne was released in 1972 and quietly disappeared from public life. Her exact whereabouts after that are unknown. The case left behind a lasting sense of unease, not just because of the tragedy, but because it seemed so senseless. There was no clear motive, no warning. Just a quiet neighbor who harbored years of obsession, rejection, and instability until one morning, it all turned deadly. Sometimes the most terrifying crimes happen not out of rage or revenge, but out of a mind that has slipped so far from reality that even a child can become a target. Marianne Colby's name may be forgotten by most, but in the neighborhood where she once lived, the memory still lingers. 7. Katrina Marie Culberson. On a warm August morning in 2012, a man driving through rural Muskingum County, Ohio, was flagged down by a woman who emerged from the weeds, her body badly burned, her voice faint but urgent. Her name was Celeste Franzman, and the last thing she did in her life was name the people who put her there. This case, one of the most haunting in Muskingum County's history, led investigators from remote hunting grounds to the inner streets of Canton, Ohio. At the center of it all was Katrina Culberson, known to some as KC, a 20-year-old woman whose past was as fractured as her future would be. Born in 1992, Culberson grew up in a home marked by instability, surrounded by drugs, street crime, and predatory influences. By her early teens, she was already caught in a web of exploitation. But her background, no matter how tragic, would not absolve her of what came next. On August 26, 2012, Celeste Fransman, 29, was found on a desolate road in the Tri-Valley Wildlife Area, beaten, strangled, and doused in gasoline. What's extraordinary is not just the horror of what happened, but Celeste's response to it. Despite burns over most of her body, she managed to walk, perhaps crawl, almost 1,500 feet from the brush to the roadside. There she was able to give her name and the names of her attackers. Within hours, detectives were already en route to Canton. Celeste died 2 days later, but her final words cracked open the case. 3 suspects were soon in custody: LaFonce Dixon Jr., Monica Washington, and Katrina Culberson. Each was charged with aggravated murder, kidnapping, and arson. Culberson, the first to strike a plea deal, admitted her role in exchange for removing the death penalty from the table. She cried in court, apologizing to Celeste's family. But her confession didn't erase the facts. She had helped lure Celeste to her death, and she was the one who lit the fire. Her attorney argued for leniency, citing a life of trauma and manipulation. But the court wasn't moved. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Monica Washington followed, receiving a similar sentence, though with a slim chance for parole after 25 years. LaFonce Dixon stood trial and was convicted. Though the jury spared him the death penalty, he too will never walk free again. But why Muskingum County? Why take a woman nearly 90 minutes from Canton to a place so isolated, so far removed from witnesses or help? Prosecutors later learned that Culberson had visited the area as a child. That familiarity became the backdrop to a horrific act that would devastate not only Celeste's family, but ripple across 2 Ohio communities. Celeste was not a stranger to struggle. Those close to her said she battled addiction, yes, but also that she had a good heart and a deep desire to change. Friends say she was trying to escape a life that pulled her down. But she was also vulnerable, and Katrina Culberson knew it. One friend later said KC was always after her. We don't know why Celeste kept going back to her. Maybe she thought they were friends. In the end, it was that misplaced trust that cost her everything. Still, Celeste left a legacy. She spoke up when it mattered most. Her final act, identifying her attackers, helped bring them to justice. As Muskingum County Prosecutor Michael Haddox put it, you either do the work or you don't get the conviction. And in this case, every effort mattered. Today, Katrina Culberson remains behind bars. She was just 22 when she was sentenced. A woman who once called herself mom to the children of a family that tried to help her. Now she'll grow old in prison, her name forever tied to a crime that shook Ohio, and to a woman whose courage, even in her final hours, refused to be silenced. 8. Dovie Blanche Dean. In the quiet farmlands of Claremont County, Ohio, few could have predicted that a 55-year-old grandmother would become the face of one of the most chilling murder cases in the state's history. Her name was Dovie Blanche Dean. A mother of 6, once known more for her modest life than any scandal, she would be executed less than 2 years after the death of her husband, whom she calmly admitted to poisoning with arsenic-laced milk. Dovie was no stranger to struggle. Born in 1898, she had lived through hard years, broken marriages, and family turmoil. But by 1952, she had married again, this time to 69-year-old Hawkins Dean, a farmer and widower. They wed just 1 day after her divorce from a previous husband was finalized. It was a whirlwind decision that would prove fatal for him. Within 4 months, Hawkins was dead. Investigators were first puzzled. Hawkins had suffered bouts of severe illness before his death, but no one suspected foul play until an autopsy revealed unmistakable traces of arsenic. Suspicion quickly turned to Dovie. When questioned, she tried to shift blame, accusing her own son from a previous marriage of poisoning Hawkins. But the sheriff, seeing through the act, posed a haunting question. If a mother can accuse her son of murder, wouldn't she be capable of it herself? Dovie didn't flinch. After a brief pause, she confessed. She said she had done it. The motive, according to Dovie, was a toxic blend of disappointment and resentment. She claimed that Hawkins had failed her emotionally and physically, and that the marriage, in her words, was built on mismatched expectations. He wanted a housekeeper, she said. I wanted a home. But the prosecution saw something else, a motive rooted in money. Shortly after their marriage, Hawkins had named Dovie the sole heir to his $27,000 estate. As far as they were concerned, she had every reason to eliminate him. Over the month of August 1952, she slipped arsenic into his milk on 4 separate occasions. Hawkins grew violently ill and eventually died on August 22nd. Her attempt to call for an ambulance was later used as a defense proof. She said that she didn't mean to kill him. But the jury wasn't convinced. At trial, Dovie remained composed, too composed, in fact. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. A psychiatrist later described her emotional state as flat, almost impenetrable. She was sad and melancholy, he said, but the tears would not come. The jury took just 40 minutes to reach its verdict, guilty of first-degree murder, with no recommendation for mercy. Under Ohio law at the time, that meant an automatic death sentence. On January 15, 1954, Dovie Dean became the second woman ever executed in Ohio's electric chair. Wearing a simple green dress and brown shoes, she declined cookies, drank coffee, and waited. Her final request, to have someone sing "What a Friend We Have in Jesus," was quietly denied, so the hymn was read aloud instead. Before the switch was pulled, she made one final statement. When I got on the witness stand, they made light of me because I couldn't cry. I had grief inside like knives. At exactly 8:00 p.m., the sentence was carried out. 7 minutes later, Dovie Dean was pronounced dead. Her story has lingered not just for the crime, but for her unnerving calm. In a courtroom full of emotion, Dovie never shed a single tear. Some saw cruelty. Others saw a woman broken long before the final act. Either way, she left behind a question that still echoes: what turns a housewife into a killer? 9. Nicole Dyer. Nicole Dyer was just 4 years old when her nightgown caught fire. Her brother had been playing with matches. The blaze left her with permanent scars and a childhood marked by pain surgeries and stigma. She would later channel that trauma into helping other burn victims, working at camps for children with similar injuries, trying to give back. But decades later, Nicole would be accused of something no one expected: the murder of her own child. On August 27, 2003, a fire broke out in Nicole's Lorain, Ohio home. Nicole survived. Her 4-year-old son Jacob did not. His body was found in his bedroom lying next to his puppy. But autopsy results revealed something disturbing. Jacob had likely died before the fire ever started. He had no soot in his lungs and low carbon monoxide levels, suggesting he wasn't alive when the flames consumed the house. Investigators began to suspect arson. The fire appeared to have been intentionally set, with gasoline used as an accelerant. Though no container was recovered, the burn patterns pointed to deliberate ignition. Nicole told police she'd tried to save her son, but couldn't reach him through the smoke. Yet first responders noted something odd: no burns, no soot, and no sign she had actually re-entered the home. Her clothes were clean. Her story didn't match the evidence. Then came the detail that shocked the public. The day after Jacob's funeral, Nicole was seen out at a bar, drinking and singing karaoke. Her behavior, described as cold and emotionless, quickly became part of the case against her. Prosecutors alleged Nicole viewed Jacob as a burden. They claimed she often left him with babysitters and gave them instructions to medicate him with codeine to help him sleep, despite no prescription and against medical guidance. Witnesses testified that Nicole wanted a social life, and Jacob got in the way. The defense told a different story. Nicole, they said, had always loved Jacob. He was her miracle baby, something she believed she'd never have due to her childhood injuries. They argued that her emotional distance came from a life of trauma, not guilt. Experts testified that she suffered from a personality disorder and had learned to suppress emotion as a survival mechanism. In October 2005, the jury found Nicole Dr. guilty of aggravated murder and arson. She was sentenced to death. But 3 years later, the Ohio Supreme Court overturned that sentence not because of doubts about the case, but due to a technical error. The jury had not been properly instructed on their ability to consider life in prison as an alternative. Rather than face a new death penalty trial, Nicole agreed to a life sentence without parole in 2010. She remains incarcerated to this day. Her case leaves lingering questions. Some believe justice was served. Others see a flawed investigation shaped more by judgment of her lifestyle than hard evidence. Nicole has always maintained her innocence, and her family has stood by her. But one thing is certain: Jacob is gone. And whether through malice, neglect, or tragedy, his story ends with flames and a mother the world has never fully understood. 10. Nancy Farrar. In 1851, the bustling streets of Cincinnati, Ohio, were a picture of growing ambition. Industry flourished, and families sought stability in an uncertain time. But inside one home behind closed doors, death crept quietly and repeatedly. Her name was Nancy Farrar. A nurse by trade, she seemed plain quiet and entirely unremarkable. Born into obscurity, Nancy's early life left little trace in the public record. What is known paints a bleak portrait: the daughter of a self-proclaimed prophetess and a father lost to alcoholism. Raised in an environment shaped by instability and delusion, Nancy grew into a woman of few words, distant demeanor, and eventually deadly intent. Between 1851 and 1852, Nancy took a position in the household of Elisha Forrest, a respected Cincinnati resident. What followed was a series of sudden illnesses and untimely deaths that would unravel a chilling pattern. Within her first week of employment, Nancy prepared a meal that left Mrs. Forrest violently ill. She lingered for days before succumbing. Soon after, 2 of the Forrest children, John Edward and Jimmy, fell sick in the same manner. Both died in quick succession, their symptoms eerily similar: vomiting, weakness, a slow descent toward death. Suspicions swirled when Nancy began making unsettling remarks, cold predictions that more members of the family would die, and casual jokes about her uncanny knack with the terminally ill. But when she uttered a line that chilled the room, "Maybe I did," after being asked if she had caused the deaths, the Forrest family began to look beyond coincidence. A post-mortem examination revealed arsenic in Jimmy Forrest's stomach. Soon, druggists from across the city came forward, recalling Nancy purchasing arsenic in suspicious quantities. Her reason: killing rats. But as evidence mounted, it was clear that her targets walked on 2 legs. Nancy Farrar was arrested and brought to trial in 1852. What began as a straightforward prosecution soon veered into more uncertain territory. Was Nancy truly criminally responsible, or was she insane? At the time, American courts were still grappling with how to interpret mental illness within the bounds of law. The Monotone Rule, established less than a decade earlier in Britain, held that defendants could not be held accountable if they could not distinguish right from wrong. Ohio, however, had yet to fully adopt these standards. The trial focused heavily on Nancy's demeanor, her withdrawn behavior, odd remarks, and even her appearance judged by now debunked phrenological ideas. The jury found her guilty, but questions lingered. Justice John Corwin of the Ohio Supreme Court later overturned the conviction, citing flawed jury instructions and inappropriate behavior during deliberation. In a rare legal reversal, he concluded that Nancy was insane and not fit to be held criminally liable. She was committed to an asylum, her life beyond that moment lost to history. Nancy Farrar left behind no legacy of infamy, no final statement, no recorded confession. Only questions remain. What drove her to kill? Was it resentment, delusion, or something deeper, something unknowable? In a case defined not just by murder, but by a legal system struggling to understand the human mind. Nancy Farrar became more than a criminal. She became a question the courts and society were not yet ready to answer. 11. Nikole Flagg. In the quiet neighborhood of Pleasant Ridge in Cincinnati, Ohio, a disturbing story unfolded, one of betrayal, lost trust, and a chilling return to violence. At the center of it stood Nikole Flagg, a woman with a past that had already claimed one life and would soon be linked to another. Born in 1973, Nikole Flagg's early life remains largely undocumented. But by the early 2000s, she had already stepped into the criminal justice system. In 2003, she pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and aggravated robbery for her role in the death of 42-year-old Jeffrey Brown. According to prosecutors, Flagg allowed 2 accomplices into Brown's apartment, where he was shot and killed. For her involvement, she served 8 years in prison. Upon her release, Nikole expressed remorse. In a letter to prison officials, she promised to give back, writing, "I have hurt a lot of people, so I have a lot of making up to do." But her words would soon ring hollow. On April 10, 2015, Flagg's name would surface again, this time connected to a far more personal crime. Her 61-year-old mother, Mervinia Lowe, failed to return calls from her son, Maurice Allen. Concerned, he contacted police. When officers arrived at Lowe's apartment, they found the lights on, music playing, but no answer at the door. They entered through a window. Inside, they discovered Lowe's body. She had been stabbed repeatedly. Her car keys, credit cards, and phone were missing. Strangely, the voicemail on her cell phone had been replaced by a recording of teenagers rapping something Maurice immediately found suspicious. There were signs that someone had tried to clean the scene with bleach. Investigators quickly identified Nikole Flagg as a suspect. She had lived with her mother as recently as the previous fall, and she had a known criminal history. Days later, on April 22nd, Flagg turned herself in to police. In court, she maintained her innocence. "I didn't murder my mother," she told the judge. She even offered a phone number in court, suggesting someone out there knew the truth. But the evidence pointed elsewhere. Prosecutors argued that this was a robbery that turned deadly. Flagg's behavior, they said, followed a pattern. First a man in 2003, now her own mother in 2015. And though Flagg reportedly suffered from bipolar disorder, her mental state was not central to the court's findings. In December 2016, Nikole Flagg was found guilty of aggravated murder and other charges. On January 9, 2017, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case is a haunting reminder that sometimes the most dangerous betrayals come not from strangers, but from those closest to us. Flagg's own son described his mother, Mervinia Lowe, as loving, devoted, and hard-working, a woman who spent years caring for others at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. Now 2 families live with permanent loss, and Nikole Flagg remains behind bars, her life defined not by redemption, but by choices that left a trail of grief and unanswered questions. 12. Angela Garcia. In the early morning hours of November 20th, 1999, A quiet Cleveland neighborhood was shaken by a house fire that would leave 2 young lives lost and spark decades of legal battles and unanswered questions. At the center of it all was 24-year-old Angela Garcia, a young mother facing the most serious charge imaginable. Angela Garcia wasn't known to police before that night. A mother of 2, she was renting a home on Harvard Avenue. Her daughters, 3-year-old Naima Garcia and 2-year-old Nija Evans, were asleep upstairs when flames engulfed the house. Angela managed to escape. Her daughters did not. Initial reports from fire investigators suggested the blaze may have started accidentally. A large candle left unattended was the likely culprit. A trained arson dog found no traces of accelerants, and the home was demolished just 2 days later before any physical evidence could be preserved. But that wasn't the end of the story. About a month later, the narrative shifted. Investigators revised their findings after learning Garcia had filed an inflated insurance claim for $40,000, far more than the actual value of her belongings. Suddenly, the fire was no longer just a tragedy. It was a crime. Angela Garcia was indicted on charges of aggravated murder-manslaughter and insurance fraud. Prosecutors alleged she had deliberately set the fire to collect insurance money, trapping her own children in the process. The case would go to trial, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The first 2 juries couldn't reach a unanimous verdict. But in 2001, during the 3rd trial, Garcia was found guilty and sentenced to 2 life terms in prison without the possibility of parole until 2049. One of the more controversial pieces of evidence came from a jailhouse informant who claimed Garcia confessed to starting 2 fires for financial gain. Prosecutors also highlighted inconsistencies in her account of that night and pointed to what they saw as a lack of emotion. But no physical evidence of accelerants was ever recovered, and no clear explanation was ever offered for how the fire truly began. Angela maintained her innocence throughout, and her attorneys argued she had passed multiple polygraph tests. "We're 100% sure of her innocence," her lawyer said after the conviction. Still, the appeal that followed focused only on procedural issues, not on how the fire was investigated. That would come years later. In 2014, new defense attorneys filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that the original investigation relied on outdated fire science methods that modern experts now consider flawed or unreliable. Since Garcia's conviction, arson investigation has evolved dramatically, moving away from intuition and visual patterns to evidence-based analysis. Nationally, these changes have led to overturned convictions in similar cases. A fire expert who reviewed Garcia's case stated plainly, the cause of the fire should have been considered undetermined. The demolition of the home meant no tests could ever confirm or disprove arson. Today, Angela Garcia remains in prison. But her case stands at the crossroads of science and justice, a sobering example of how evolving forensic standards can reshape even the most devastating convictions. Whether or not a new trial is granted, one thing remains painfully clear: 2 children are gone, and the full truth of what happened that night may never be fully known. 13. Cynthia George. On a quiet summer morning in Akron, Ohio, a single gunshot shattered the peace and the life of 44-year-old Jeff Zach. The shooter, clad in black and hidden behind a motorcycle helmet, disappeared without a trace. But what began as a mysterious execution-style killing would unravel into one of the most sensational and controversial cases in Ohio's legal history. At the center was Cynthia George. By all appearances, she was the wife of a prominent businessman, a mother of 7, and a fixture in Akron's elite social circles. But behind the designer clothes and lavish lifestyle, Cynthia led a double life marked by secret affairs, whispered threats, and a volatile love triangle. Jeff Zach was more than just an ex-lover. For nearly a decade, he and Cynthia had carried on a passionate and public affair. Their relationship produced a child, something both families struggled to hide. But when Cynthia ended the relationship and found comfort in a new man, John Zaffino Zach didn't let go. He called, frequently showed up uninvited, and allegedly threatened Cynthia's family. On June 16, 2001, Jeff Zach was shot in the head while pumping gas at a BJ's wholesale club. Witnesses saw a motorcyclist flee the scene. Police were left with a single question: who wanted Jeff Zach dead? It took nearly a year to identify John Zaffino as the man on the motorcycle. He was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder in 2003, sentenced to life in prison. Still, whispers lingered about Cynthia's role. Had she ordered the hit, or had Zaffino acted alone out of obsession? In 2005, 4 years after the murder, Cynthia George was arrested and charged with complicity to commit aggravated murder. Prosecutors said she helped Zaffino plan Zach's death, pointing to financial records, intimate letters, and phone calls made just before and after the killing. Her trial captivated the public. Cynthia declined to testify, but the prosecution presented evidence of a life built on secrets. They argued that Cynthia had both motive and means: an ex-lover who wouldn't let go, a new partner willing to kill, and a high-profile reputation to protect. In November 2005, Cynthia was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, eligible for parole only after 23 years. But the story didn't end there. In March 2007, the Ohio Court of Appeals reversed her conviction, ruling the evidence was too weak to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Cynthia was released after serving just 16 months. The Ohio Supreme Court later declined to review the case. Legally, it was over. She could never be tried again. To this day, Cynthia George maintains her innocence. Prosecutors insist she was involved. And Jeff Zach's family believes justice was never truly served. In a case fueled by passion, wealth, and betrayal, one truth remains: the man who pulled the trigger is behind bars, but the woman who may have inspired it walked free. 14. Anna Marie Hahn. In the quiet German neighborhoods of Cincinnati during the early 1930s, a figure moved through homes with a gentle smile and a helping hand. She called herself a nurse, though she had no formal training. Her patients were always elderly, always alone, and too often they never lived long after her arrival. Her name was Anna Marie Hahn. Known later as Arsenic Anna and the Blonde Borgia, she would become Ohio's first female to die in the electric chair, leaving behind a trail of mystery, greed, and death. Born in Bavaria in 1906, Anna immigrated to the U.S. in her early 20s. She married a telephone operator and settled in Cincinnati's German district, raising a son and briefly managing a bakery. But Anna had bigger ambitions, ones that didn't involve long hours or hard work. She developed a dangerous habit: gambling. To fuel it, she needed money, and fast. So Anna turned to what seemed to her a simple solution: offering care to elderly men in exchange for room board and companionship. Her charm masked a darker intent. In 1932, her first known victim, 73-year-old Ernest Koch, died suddenly. In his will, he left Anna a house. Not long after, Albert Parker, another elderly client, also died, shortly after giving Anna a substantial loan. The promissory note vanished with his breath. By 1937, Anna had befriended Jacob Wagner, who would bequeath her $17,000. George Gesellman followed, leaving her $15,000. In each case, death came quickly, after a sudden, inexplicable illness. In one chilling account, a surviving victim, George Heiss, claimed he became violently ill after Anna offered him a mug of beer. He noticed that a pair of houseflies died instantly after landing in the drink. He sent her away. It likely saved his life. But Anna's final act would bring her undoing. In the summer of 1937, she traveled to Colorado Springs with another elderly man, George Obendorfer, and her son, Oscar. Obendorfer was promised a trip to Anna's ranch. Instead, he died in a hotel room in agony. An autopsy revealed arsenic. The bank account he shared with Anna had been looted. Authorities grew suspicious. When Anna refused to pay for George's funeral, the investigation intensified. She returned to Cincinnati unaware that police were already exhuming the bodies of her former patients. Each showed traces of poison. Each pointed to Anna. Her trial in 1937 gripped the nation. 11 of the 12 jurors were women. The evidence was overwhelming. Her motives chillingly simple: greed and a craving for control. Witnesses recounted her lavish spending, her obsession with gambling, and her ability to deceive. She was found guilty and sentenced to die. On December 7, 1938, Anna Marie Hahn was executed by electric chair. Her final moments were desperate pleading, but her fate was sealed. Her legacy endures not just as a killer, but as a warning of how charm can mask cruelty and how trust, when misplaced, can be fatal. In the end, Arsenic Anna earned her place in American criminal history not as a caregiver, but as a killer cloaked in kindness. 15. Judith Worcester Hawkey. On the surface, Judith Hawkey was a quiet presence in a small Ohio town. A wife, a mother, a caretaker. But behind closed doors, in a home tucked away in Mark Center, a far darker story was unfolding, one that would take 10 years to surface and forever shatter a family. Judith was born in 1967 and married Robert Breininger, a 34-year-old father raising a young son, Corey. In 2003, the three lived together in a modest home. To the outside world, they seemed like any other family. But what no one saw was the manipulation, the psychological torment, and the years of silent abuse building toward a calculated act. On November 3, 2003, Defiance County deputies responded to a 911 call. Robert Breininger had been shot in the head. His 10-year-old son told police it was an accident. His father had been showing him a gun when it went off. The case was closed as a tragic mishap. Judith, now a grieving widow, collected nearly $500,000 in life insurance. But nothing about the story sat right. Years passed. Judith moved on. And Corey carried a burden too heavy for a child, until almost a decade later, he finally told the truth. In 2013, Corey, now a young man, revealed to a trusted adult that the shooting hadn't been an accident. It had been orchestrated. He testified that Judith, his stepmother, had abused and manipulated him for years. She had coached him, threatened him, and ultimately forced him to pull the trigger. Not out of rage, but out of fear and greed. When investigators reopened the case, they found enough evidence to secure a grand jury indictment. Judith Hawkey was arrested and charged with aggravated murder, child endangerment, and insurance fraud. Her trial began in late 2013. Prosecutors presented Corey's testimony along with a disturbing pattern of abuse. Witnesses described years of psychological control and coercion. Corey had lived in fear not only of the punishment he might face, but of the woman who had turned his childhood into a nightmare. Hawkey denied everything. In court, she insisted that Corey acted on his own, that the story was fabricated. But the jury saw through her defense. After deliberating, they returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. On December 18, 2013, Judith Hawkey was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called her evil beyond description. For Corey, the trial was not just about justice, it was about release. I was bearing that burden for so many years, he told the court. Now I can stop living in the shadows. Today, Judith Hawkey remains incarcerated, a life defined by betrayal and manipulation. Her case stands as a stark reminder that not all monsters hide in the dark. Some smile, some comfort, and some quietly destroy lives from the inside out. 16. Tonya Lynn Hawks. In the quiet town of Phillipsburg, Ohio, nestled among small homes and quiet streets, no one could have imagined the tragedy that would unfold behind the closed door of a modest white house. On February 11, 2006, 4 lives were discovered, lost 3 young boys and their mother. The woman was Tonya Lynn Hawks. She was 30 years old. To her friends and co-workers, she was a devoted mother, someone who lived for her children, who worked hard, and who never seemed to crack under pressure. But behind her quiet strength was a storm few could see coming. Tonya had faced mounting stress in the months before her death. Financial hardship, a pending divorce, and the breakdown of a recent relationship had left her increasingly isolated. Yet to outsiders, she remained composed. At the bare thermal plant where she worked, her locker was plastered with photos of her sons, Chase 5, Cole 4, and Hunter 2. They were by all accounts her entire world. But on February 7th, something changed. Investigators later learned that Tonya had purchased a .380 caliber semi-automatic handgun just 8 days before. 4 days passed in silence. Neighbors grew concerned when the lights stayed off, the dog barked incessantly, and no one came or went. On February 11th, neighbors looked through a window, saw a child inside, and broke down the door. What they found was devastating. Tonya and all 3 of her sons were dead from gunshot wounds. The 2 youngest were tucked into bed in pajamas. The oldest, Chase, was found in an armchair, also in his sleepwear. Tonya was discovered in the bathroom. The handgun lay on the living room couch. Authorities found no signs of a break-in. No struggle, no outside involvement. In a child's backpack, a single-page note, Tonya's instructions for handling her affairs, confirmed their grim conclusion: murder-suicide. The motive remains unclear. Some point to the emotional toll of her breakup, her pending divorce, and the pressure of raising 3 children alone. Others struggle to reconcile the loving mother they knew with the actions she took. One friend recalled, "She lived her life for her kids. I'll never understand it." Experts in maternal filicide describe a troubling yet tragically familiar profile. Cheryl Meyer, a scholar on the subject, called Tonya's case a classic example. She noted that many such mothers are described as deeply devoted, but they reach a breaking point, one where their children feel like an extension of their own despair. It's not hate that drives them. It's hopelessness. Tonya's death and the loss of her 3 young sons left a community reeling. Friends mourned a woman they believed had done everything for her children. Others struggled to process the weight of her final act. In the years since, her story has remained largely quiet, tucked into the margins of local memory. But it raises a haunting question with no simple answer. What hidden despair can live behind a mother's smile? And how do we truly know when someone is slipping beyond the point of return? 17. Amber C. Hill. In the early afternoon of October 1st, 2007, a call came in that would shatter a family and leave an entire community searching for answers. When first responders arrived at a modest apartment in Cleveland, Ohio, they discovered a quiet scene that belied the horror within. 2 little girls, just 4 and 2 years old, were found lifeless in the bathtub. Their mother, Amber Hill, sat on the couch nearby, dazed and unresponsive. Amber Hill was 23 years old. Born in 1985, she was described as kind, bubbly, and devoted to her daughters Janelle and Cecesse. She had no prior criminal history, no record of neglect or abuse. To friends and family, she appeared to be a loving mother, doing her best under difficult circumstances. But beneath the surface, Amber was battling something far more dangerous than anyone realized: her own mind. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Amber showed signs of deepening depression. She had withdrawn from school, become paranoid, and confided in family that she was hearing voices. On the very day her children died, she was scheduled to meet with a psychiatrist. She never made it to that appointment. According to court testimony, Amber's mental state had deteriorated into full-blown psychosis. She later told a psychologist that she believed she and her children were suffering, connected in pain, and that by ending their lives, she could finally bring them peace. She spoke of voices urging her to act, voices she believed came from her mother, her boyfriend, even something darker. Amber didn't run. She didn't attempt to cover her actions. Instead, she called the children's father, Jaime Cintron, and told him the girls were at peace. He rushed home only to find the unimaginable. When police arrived, Amber sat motionless, showing no visible reaction to the chaos around her. Charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder, Amber Hill pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. A jury trial was waived. Instead, a panel of 3 judges heard the case. Both a defense expert and a court-appointed psychiatrist testified that Amber suffered from severe depression with psychotic features. They agreed she did not understand the wrongfulness of her actions. On January 24, 2009, the court delivered its verdict not guilty by reason of insanity. Amber was not sentenced to prison. Instead, she was committed indefinitely to a high-security psychiatric facility. There, under close supervision, she receives treatment for her condition. Her release, if it ever happens, would require a judge's approval and medical assurance that she no longer poses a danger. But even under medication, Amber has expressed doubt about her diagnosis, a troubling sign that continues to weigh heavily on the court. Judge John Sutula put it plainly, "God didn't intervene on behalf of your children." His concern wasn't only for Amber's well-being, but for the safety of others should she ever be released. Today, Amber Hill remains institutionalized. Her case is a stark and painful reminder of what untreated mental illness can become, and of the haunting question that lingers in tragedies like this. How do we protect those at risk when they themselves can no longer recognize the danger? 18. Joy D. Hodge. In a quiet neighborhood of Warren, Ohio, the events of one September morning in 2011 shattered a family and left a city searching for clarity. Inside a small home on Transylvania Avenue, 15-month-old Anana Brantley was found lifeless in her crib. What followed was a months-long investigation that revealed a deeply disturbing truth and a mother at the center of it all. Joy D. Hodge was 28 at the time, a mother of 4 known by friends and neighbors as quiet and reserved. She lived alone with her children, and on the surface appeared to be doing her best. But behind the closed doors of her home, something had gone terribly wrong. On the morning of September 6, 2011, authorities were called to the Hodge residence. They discovered Anana cold and unresponsive. The child had visible bruises and internal injuries, signs of blunt force trauma. Hodge claimed she had given her daughter a sippy cup that morning and found her unresponsive hours later. But the evidence told a different story. Investigators quickly uncovered inconsistencies. Hodge gave conflicting accounts of the night before. She admitted to leaving Anana home alone while she went out with friends for drinks and karaoke. She returned home sometime between midnight and 3 a.m., but medical examiners determined the child had likely died in the early hours of the morning, long before Hodge's version of events. 9 days passed before Hodge was arrested. A private investigator working alongside police recorded her admitting that she had popped Anana once for biting another time for getting into household cleaners. But she insisted that she did not cause her daughter's death. She even suggested someone may have entered her home and done it, claiming they had also stolen banana pudding from her refrigerator. Despite her denials, the physical evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy revealed a swollen brain, a lacerated liver, and extensive bruising. Prosecutors argued that the fatal injuries were inflicted in a sudden moment of violence, what one detective called one explosive moment. In December 2012, after a swift deliberation, a jury found Joy Hodge guilty of murder, felonious assault, and child endangering. 2 months later, she was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole in 2027, but the court also mandated 3 years of supervision if she is ever released. To this day, Hodge maintains her innocence, and her family has voiced doubts about the verdict. But prosecutors remain firm in their conclusion. They say she misled investigators, delayed the investigation, and ultimately was responsible for the death of her child. David Brantley. Anana's father spoke through tears during sentencing. He said he wasn't angry. He still loved Joy. But he also knew the loss of his daughter and the fall of the woman he once loved was something he'd carry for the rest of his life. Joy Hodge's case is one of quiet tragedy. There are no headlines of infamy, no nationwide outcry, just a life cut short, and a mother left to face the consequences of a single irreversible act. 19. Sandra K. Inman. It was late on the night of March 22, 2011, when 25-year-old Summer Inman stepped into an alley behind a Logan, Ohio bank, taking out the trash from her cleaning job. What happened next would ignite a manhunt, a community-wide search, and a tragic unraveling of family ties ending in betrayal loss and a septic tank behind a church. At the center of it all was Sandra K. Inman, a wife, a mother, and on that night, the driver of a car that would carry her daughter-in-law to her death. Sandra Inman was 44 years old, born in 1967, married to William Bill Inman, and mother to William Jr., known as Will. The family had always been close, perhaps too close. When Summer Inman left her marriage in 2010 and took her 3 children with her, the Inmans saw it as a betrayal. Summer was seeking freedom, but Sandra, desperate to stay connected to her grandchildren, saw only a door slamming shut. According to Sandra's own confession, it was her idea to confront Summer that night. She wanted to talk, to beg for time with the kids. But what unfolded was no conversation, it was an abduction. Summer was forcibly pulled into a car. Sandra was at the wheel. In the back seat, her son Will restrained his estranged wife with zip ties. Within minutes, Summer was dead. Sandra claimed it was accidental. Her son panicked the zip tie too tight. But the outcome was irreversible. For days, Summer's disappearance baffled the community. Prayer vigils were held. Her parents pleaded for answers. And then 2 days later, Sandra, her husband, and her son were arrested, each charged with kidnapping. It would be Sandra who eventually led investigators to the body concealed in a septic tank behind Faith Tabernacle Church, a place where the Inmans once worshipped. In court, Sandra Inman pleaded guilty to murder, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and gross abuse of a corpse. Her sentence, 15 years to life in prison. She wept in front of Summer's family and apologized, saying, "That was never supposed to happen. I loved Summer." But for Summer's parents, the damage was already done. They were now raising the couple's 3 young children left without a mother and effectively without a father or grandparents. In a letter read aloud during sentencing, they wrote, "Sorry, Alex. You will never have a mommy or daddy, and you will never grow up with Nana either." Sandra's husband Bill and son Will were both convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court rejected claims of accidental death and coercion. This wasn't just a family dispute gone wrong, it was a coordinated act that turned deadly. Sandra Inman remains behind bars. Her name, once unknown outside Logan, is now linked forever to a tragic case of love warped by control and the fatal consequences of a family that couldn't let go. 20. Taylor M. Marks. In the quiet suburbs of Akron, Ohio, 20-year-old Taylor Marks seemed to have every advantage: an education, financial security, and a mother who adored her. But behind the image of a privileged young woman was a brewing resentment, one that would ultimately cost a life and shatter 3 more. Taylor Marks was adopted as a child by Christy Marks and her late husband, Bruce. By most accounts, Christy was a loving and generous mother. She owned a successful home healthcare business and provided her daughter with opportunities that many could only dream of. But somewhere along the way, that bond fractured. On the night of October 24, 2009, Christy Marks was lured to an apartment parking lot under the impression she was helping her daughter through another crisis. She had no idea that her own child had orchestrated the entire setup. Waiting in the shadows was 19-year-old Troy Purdy, a friend of Taylor's boyfriend, Brian Smith. As Christy stepped from her car, she was attacked and fatally stabbed 13 times. Taylor had promised Purdy $5,000 for the murder money she expected to inherit from her mother's estate. But the plan unraveled almost instantly. All 3 were present at the scene when police arrived. Their stories didn't match. Within hours, under questioning, the truth came out. Confessions were signed. The plot, carefully whispered about for weeks, collapsed in less than 4 hours. Prosecutors charged Taylor with aggravated murder, alleging she was the driving force behind the crime. Initially facing the death penalty under Ohio's murder-for-hire statute, she eventually pled guilty in exchange for life in prison without parole. At just 21 years old, Taylor stood before the court and tearfully admitted her guilt. "Today I got what I deserve for my actions," she said, sobbing through a handwritten statement. "I lost control of my state of mind over something small and took it out on my mother." Her co-conspirator, Troy Purdy, also received life without parole. Brian Smith, Taylor's boyfriend, awaited trial on the same charge but did not face the death penalty. Judge Tom Parker, who presided over the case, reflected on the gravity of the moment. In many ways, he said, "This is a tragic day, because not only are we coming to grips with the loss of Christy Marks, we now must come to grips with the loss of Taylor Marks from this community." As the courtroom emptied, the question lingered: how does a child grow to view a parent as an obstacle rather than a protector? While some point to manipulation, others see cold calculation. Taylor now lives out her days in an Ohio prison, her future sealed by a decision fueled by anger, entitlement, and greed. Christy Marks, remembered by those who knew her as selfless and kind, left behind more than a successful business. She left a cautionary tale of misplaced trust and the devastating cost of betrayal from within one's own family. 21. Holly McFeature. In the heart of Cleveland, Ohio, a young couple shared a home, a family, and what appeared to be a future together. But behind closed doors, tension simmered until one summer day in 2006, it boiled over into something far more sinister. Holly McFeature was 28 years old, a mother of 3, a bartender, and by most accounts, a woman who seemed devoted to her children. But prosecutors would later describe her very differently: calculating, deceptive, and patient. The kind of person who didn't lash out in anger, but who quietly stirred poison into a glass. Her target was Matthew Podolak, the 31-year-old father of 2 of her children. According to investigators, their relationship was strained. McFeature wanted out. But instead of walking away, she chose another path. Over several weeks, prosecutors say she laced Matthew's favorite drink, raspberry iced tea, with small doses of antifreeze. At first, the symptoms were subtle. Podolak experienced back pain, fatigue, nausea. Doctors misdiagnosed it as kidney stones. But on July 31, 2006, he collapsed and died. The cause was eventually determined to be ethylene glycol, poisoning the key chemical in antifreeze. but the manner of death. At the time, it was undetermined. No charges were filed, and so the case went cold. For 6 years. It wasn't until 2012 that a tip to Cleveland police reopened the file. The new information suggested Podolak's death had been no accident, and that McFeature had allegedly confessed to a former boyfriend. That man Jameson Kennedy claimed she once said she had put something in Podolak's drink. With that revelation, prosecutors moved forward. Holly McFeature was arrested and charged with aggravated murder and contaminating a substance for human consumption. Her trial began in the summer of 2013. The prosecution argued that McFeature had slowly poisoned Podolak to end the relationship and avoid a messy separation. They pointed to her behavior after his death, described by his family as strangely detached, and to Kennedy's testimony, which, though controversial, proved critical. The defense pushed back, claiming Matthew may have taken his own life, citing personal stress and health issues. They argued the state's evidence was circumstantial and the witness unreliable. But after a week-long trial, the jury returned a verdict guilty. On August 28, 2013, Holly McFeature was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She wept in court as her children's letters were read aloud, describing her as a kind, loving mother. Podolak's family, meanwhile, mourned not only the loss of a son and brother, but the years it took to see justice served. Today, McFeature remains incarcerated, her case a chilling example of quiet, calculated harm committed within the walls of a home. A slow betrayal hidden behind sweet tea and routine. As Judge Brian Corrigan put it, "You could have walked away, but instead, you inflicted unimaginable pain." And for the 2 young children caught in the middle, that pain is a legacy they'll carry for the rest of their lives. 22. Tabitha Messina. In the quiet suburb of South Euclid, Ohio, a brutal crime shattered the silence of a warm summer morning. By all appearances, 18-year-old Tabitha Messina had lived a life marked by rebellion and unrest, but few could have predicted the devastating path she would take. Tabitha Messina was born in 1988 and raised in a turbulent home. Her relationship with her father, Richard Messina Sr., was often explosive. Neighbors and police were no strangers to the Messina household. Officers were dispatched to their address nearly 70 times over 2 years for complaints ranging from noise to domestic disturbances. Yet despite the dysfunction, few could have imagined the violence that would unfold on July 29, 2007. That morning, Richard Messina and his longtime girlfriend, Sandra Cover, were asleep inside their South Euclid home when they were attacked. Prosecutors later revealed that Tabitha and her boyfriend, 19-year-old Carlos Christopher, broke into the home armed with an axe and a crowbar. What happened next was swift, calculated, and final. After the killings, they ransacked the house and fled, stealing 2 vehicles, a Corvette and a GMC Jimmy. 2 days later, nearly 500 miles away in North Carolina, sheriff's deputies responded to a call about an unresponsive person in a parked vehicle. Inside, they found Tabitha and Carlos asleep in the stolen SUV. A routine license plate check linked them directly to the double homicide. Without resistance, they were taken into custody. What followed was a series of legal proceedings that revealed the deeper cracks in Tabitha's past. Her attorneys claimed she was manipulated by Carlos, that she never intended for anyone to die. But the evidence told a different story. Witnesses described Tabitha as manipulative and prone to lying, even from a young age, often provoking conflict, then seeking sympathy in its aftermath. In September 2008, she pled guilty to 2 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of robbery. A month later, the sentence was handed down, 60 years to life in prison. She will be eligible for parole at the age of 80. In the courtroom, emotions ran high. Family members of both victims expressed deep sorrow and anger. Sandra Cover's mother held up a photo of her daughter and told the judge, "There are no words to describe the pain." Richard Messina's sister, Tabitha's own aunt, said solemnly, "When you forgot to respect him as your father, we forgot you were our niece." Her co-defendant, Carlos Christopher, was convicted earlier that year and received life without the possibility of parole. He offered an apology in court, but never an explanation. Today, Tabitha Messina remains behind bars, her name remembered not for redemption, but for betrayal. A daughter who crossed a line few ever do, driven by resentment, and perhaps something darker. The home on Donwell Drive is quiet now. But for the families left behind, the echoes of that summer morning, in 2007, still linger along with a question that may never be answered. How does love turn so completely into loss? 23. Donna J. Munda. In the world of medicine, Dr. Ghulam Munda was admired, a respected urologist, a generous mentor, and a self-made man. He had built a life defined by compassion and success after emigrating from India, becoming a beloved figure in his Pennsylvania community. But his life ended not at the hands of a stranger, but through a plot orchestrated by someone much closer. His wife, Donna J. Munda. Donna, born in 1959, seemed to have it all. A career in healthcare, financial security, and the admiration that came with being the spouse of a prominent physician. But beneath that image was a pattern of deception, entitlement, and eventually deadly ambition. In 2004, her world began to unravel. She was caught stealing fentanyl from the hospital where she worked, leading to her dismissal and mandated rehab. It was there that she met Damian Bradford, a 25-year-old drug dealer with charm, swagger, and a criminal record. The two began a secret affair. Donna showered him with expensive gifts, paid his rent, and offered him a lifestyle far beyond his means. But what she promised next was more sinister: a share of her future inheritance if he would kill her husband. On May 13, 2005, during a family road trip along the Ohio Turnpike, Donna pulled the car over on a pretense to switch drivers. Bradford was waiting. He approached the vehicle, demanded Dr. Munda's wallet, and then shot him once in the head. The crime was staged to look like a random highway robbery, but investigators quickly uncovered inconsistencies. Donna's story didn't add up. She gave conflicting descriptions of the suspect. Cell phone records showed frequent contact with Bradford the day of the murder, and eventually Bradford confessed. He testified that Donna had planned it all and promised him up to $3 million from her husband's estate. Faced with a capital murder charge, Donna maintained her innocence, claiming she had no knowledge of Bradford's intentions. But the jury saw it differently. In July 2007, she was convicted of murder-for-hire interstate stalking, resulting in death and 2 firearms-related charges. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Damian Bradford received a reduced sentence of 17.5 years in exchange for his testimony. He admitted he pulled the trigger, but insisted it was Donna who gave him the motive, the map, and the promise of wealth. Since her conviction, Donna Munda has filed appeals arguing that the evidence was insufficient and that Bradford's testimony shouldn't be trusted. All have been denied. Today, she remains incarcerated in Connecticut, her name now forever linked to betrayal and greed. The Munda case endures as a chilling reminder of how ordinary lives can take extraordinary and tragic turns. Dr. Munda's legacy lives on through his patients and peers, but the story of his death is a cautionary tale, a reminder that trust once broken can cost more than a fortune. It can cost a life. 24. Angela Norman. In the quiet neighborhoods of Dayton, Ohio, lived a child whose voice was never heard, whose suffering was never seen until it was too late. Her name was Michaela Norman. 14 years old, born with cerebral palsy, and entirely dependent on others for every basic need. What should have been a life filled with care and protection ended in silence, neglect, and a justice system forced to reckon with unthinkable failure. At the center of this story is Angela Norman Michaela's mother. Born in 1969, Angela had long been her daughter's legal guardian and primary caregiver, but prosecutors would later argue she was something else entirely negligent to a level that cost her child's life. Michaela's condition made her especially vulnerable. She couldn't walk, talk, or feed herself. She required full-time care, and Medicaid-funded nursing services were put in place to support her. But that safety net collapsed in every possible way. On March 1, 2011, Angela called 911. Her daughter wasn't breathing. By the time paramedics arrived, Michaela was already gone. She weighed just 28 pounds less than a typical 3-year-old. The coroner described her as the most severely malnourished child the office had ever seen. Bed sores covered her skin. Dirt caked her body. She had been failed by every adult assigned to protect her. Investigators learned that Angela, along with a licensed nurse named Molly Parsons, were responsible for Michaela's day-to-day care. Parsons was contracted to work 6 days a week, 8 hours a day. But witnesses testified that she rarely appeared. And when she did, she was often seen picking up Angela for shopping trips, leaving Michaela behind. Notes were falsified. Warning signs were ignored. 2 supervising nurses, Catherine Williams and Mary Kilby, were also charged. Their job was to regularly inspect the home and assess Michaela's health, but both failed to act on what prosecutors called obvious signs of neglect. In the end, not a single caregiver intervened, and not a single report of abuse was ever filed until it was too late. Angela Norman was arrested 8 months later and ultimately pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment. In 2012, she was sentenced to 9 years in prison. Her co-defendant, Molly Parsons, was sentenced to 10. The other 2 nurses received probation, sparking outrage from those who believed the punishment didn't match the gravity of their inaction. Today, Angela Norman remains incarcerated. Her case stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when accountability disappears in systems meant to care for the most vulnerable. Michaela's death was not caused by one single act, but by a long, uninterrupted silence. There are cases that disturb, and then there are those that haunt. This is one of them. As one investigator put it, she was a skeleton with skin draped over it. It was horrific. In the absence of justice, Michaela Norman's story asks a single searing question: how did no one see her? 25. Erica Lynn, Orta. In the late summer of 2004, the quiet town of Defiance, Ohio, was shattered by a crime that defied comprehension. A mother murdered her body, abandoned, and her daughter behind it all. The name Erica Lynn Orta became synonymous with betrayal, not only for the act itself, but for the chilling circumstances that surrounded it. Born on December 17, 1959, Orta was no stranger to the justice system. By her mid-20s, she had a long trail of arrests from drug possession to assault. A troubled childhood years spent in and out of instability, and a volatile relationship with her mother, Diane Acton, all formed a backdrop to a life in freefall. At the time of the murder, Orta was homeless, struggling with addiction, and married to a man twice her age who was serving time for domestic violence. On August 31, 2004, Erica Orta and a man she described as her boyfriend, 43-year-old Joseph Williams, arrived at her mother's home. The plan, according to prosecutors, was theft. They came for Diane Acton's jewelry. But something darker unfolded. In Orta's own words, rage took over. Diane Acton, a 48-year-old widow, was strangled in the kitchen of her own home. What followed was a chilling attempt to erase the evidence. With Williams's help, Orta bound her mother's body with duct tape, placed her in the trunk of her own car and drove the vehicle nearly 70 miles to Lima, where she abandoned it, along with her mother's body. It would take 4 days for the car to be discovered in an impound lot. By then, Diane Acton's disappearance had become a missing persons case. But what police found inside the trunk turned it into a homicide. Orta was arrested on September 8, 2004. Initially, she entered a guilty plea as part of a deal, one that required her testimony against Williams. But when she refused to take the stand, the state dropped charges against him, and prosecutors reinstated additional charges against her. In March 2005, Orta was sentenced to 15 years to life for murder. Later that year, she received an additional 10 years for aggravated robbery and tampering with evidence, bringing her total to 25 years to life. As of now, she remains incarcerated in Ohio, not eligible for parole until at least 2030. In court, Orta frequently changed her plea and fired or disregarded her attorneys. At one point, she claimed confusion and argued that the crime stemmed from a moment of passion, not premeditation. But the court saw otherwise. The story of Erica Orta is one of deep personal chaos, of strained family bonds, addiction, and ultimately irreversible loss. Her mother, by many accounts, had battled her own challenges, but no one expected their fractured relationship to end in tragedy. As her cousin said in court, "Because of you, I had to bury my aunt and my friend. Some crimes shock, others haunt. This one lingers." 26. Inez Palmer. In the cold autumn of 1926, tucked away in the quiet hills of Vinton County, Ohio, a chilling story began to unravel. At the center of it, a young woman named Inez Palmer, 24 years old, attractive and ambitious. She had arrived from West Virginia and soon became entangled in a relationship with Arthur Stout, a local man with a troubled family and a questionable future. What followed would become one of the most bizarre and quietly disturbing murder cases of the era. Sarah Stout, Arthur's stepmother, was the first to die. On November 17, 1926, her body was found partially burned in her home, positioned carefully in front of a stove. The scene appeared accidental until the coroner determined she had been strangled, not burned alive. Her death, it seemed, was staged. Days earlier, Sarah had sworn out a warrant accusing Arthur of adultery, naming Inez Palmer as his illicit partner. It's likely she knew the danger she was walking into. Just months later, in February 1927, Sarah's husband, William Stout, also vanished. Inez told the sheriff he had gone west. But something didn't sit right with Maud Collins, Ohio's first female sheriff. Sharp, observant, and calm under pressure, Maud wasn't easily fooled. And she wasn't about to be outwitted by a forged will, a lunch pail beneath a tree, or a pair of carefully planted footprints. The will named Arthur Stout as William's sole heir, excluding his other sons. But there were no witnesses, and handwriting samples from the local bank proved it wasn't Williams at all. That's when Sheriff Maud started digging, literally. A tip from William's young grandsons led her to the well behind the house. That's where they found the body. William Stout had been beaten with a blunt object. In custody, Inez confessed she forged the will, faked the footprints, and placed the pail with care. She admitted she killed William because he made advances toward her. Arthur later confirmed her story and went further, stating Inez had also strangled Sarah and told him to set the body on fire. But the court didn't take either confession lightly. Arthur was convicted of second-degree murder for his role in Sarah's death. Inez, first degree. Both were sentenced to life. Inez would never be eligible for parole. Arthur, however, had a faint hope of pardon. This grim saga became a national sensation, not for its violence, but for its cunning, and for the woman who cracked the case. Sheriff Maud Collins, a young widow with 5 children, had stepped into her husband's shoes after his untimely death. But her resolve and investigative skill proved she wasn't just a placeholder. She was a force. Inez Palmer faded into the walls of the Marysville Reformatory. Arthur spent his life behind bars, but the story of the Axtell Ridge murders remains a layered tale of greed, deception, and misplaced trust. Sheriff Maud once said, "You can't fake the truth. It always finds its own way to the surface." In the hills of Ohio it did. 27. Tiffany Ann Powell. In the spring of 2014, a quiet neighborhood in Akron, Ohio, became the backdrop for a case that would shake a family and a courtroom to its core. At the center of it all stood Tiffany Ann Powell, a woman caught between desperation, deception, and a bitter custody battle that ended in tragedy. Tiffany Powell was born in 1981 and raised in difficult circumstances. By her early 30s, she was a mother of 8 children. 5 of those children were with James Harris, a retired teacher, a father of 10, and by many accounts a beloved figure in his community. But to Powell, Harris was also her ex, her legal opponent, and the man she feared would take everything she had left. On April 26, 2014, James Harris was lured to Powell's home under the pretense of buying a used car and washer. He was known for restoring and reselling items, and the offer seemed ordinary. What he didn't know was that Powell and her new boyfriend, Paul Reed, had recently moved into that house, and that day, Harris's 5 children waited unknowingly in a van outside. Prosecutors would later argue that Powell had orchestrated the entire plan. She paid a woman $100 to lure Harris into the basement where Reed was waiting. What followed was a violent confrontation. Reed testified that he acted in self-defense, claiming Harris entered with a gun. But the jury didn't see it that way. Harris suffered fatal injuries, his head struck repeatedly against the basement floor. Powell's story shifted. At trial, she claimed her intent was not to kill, but to catch Harris violating a protection order, one that, as it turned out, was no longer in effect. Her goal, she said, was to regain custody of her children. But the court didn't accept that explanation. She had lied to police, recruited a third party to set the trap, and made the call that brought Harris to his final destination. Her actions were seen not as a misguided attempt at maternal protection, but as the calculated beginning of a deadly scheme. In February 2016, Tiffany Powell was convicted of aggravated murder and obstruction of justice. She was sentenced to life in prison with parole eligibility after 30 years and 30 months. Reed had already been convicted the previous year and is serving his own life sentence. Both have appealed. The courtroom reactions were emotional and divided. Harris's daughters described their father as a loving man, an educator, a mentor, a father figure whose absence leaves a void that justice cannot fill. They rejected Powell's claims of remorse, insisting she has never taken full responsibility. Tiffany Powell sits behind bars today, largely silent, her name seldom mentioned outside of court records. Her case remains a haunting reminder of how personal disputes can spiral into irreversible decisions, where the line between victim and perpetrator becomes tragically blurred. In the words of the presiding judge, her relationship facilitated his death, and she has shown little or no remorse. Justice perhaps was served, but for those left behind, closure remains more complicated. 28. Therressa Jolynn Ritchie. On a humid July morning in 1995, Dayton, Ohio woke to a mother's frantic plea her 4-year-old daughter Samantha was missing. With pigtails and a bright pink nightgown, the child's face quickly spread across newspapers and TV screens. Volunteers poured into the streets, searching alleys and abandoned buildings. But behind the panic, behind the televised tears, a darker truth waited to emerge. Therressa Jolynn Ritchie was 24 years old, twice divorced, living in a troubled neighborhood, and struggling to keep her life from unraveling. By all appearances, she was just another young mother fighting to survive. But in the weeks that followed Samantha's disappearance, prosecutors painted a much different picture, one of neglect, deception, and fatal choices. Samantha's body was found 5 days later, submerged in a pit of water, on the grounds of an abandoned foundry just a block from her home. Investigators quickly turned their attention to the woman who had first raised the alarm. Her story unraveled under scrutiny. Just 15 days after the 911 call, Richie was arrested alongside her neighbor, 43-year-old Ernest Vernell Brooks. According to prosecutors, the motive was almost incomprehensible. Samantha had walked in on her mother during a sexual encounter with Brooks. What happened next would remain the subject of courtroom testimony denials and bitter public outrage. Brooks told the court that Richie panicked, striking her daughter with the cast on her arm, and later hiding the evidence. He admitted to helping dispose of Samantha's body, but denied delivering the fatal blow. Richie, for her part, maintained her innocence to the end. "I've been wrongly accused," she told the judge, but the jury didn't believe her. In February 1996, she was sentenced to 22 years to life in prison, with additional time for charges, including tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse, and inducing panic. Brooks received a maximum sentence of 5 years for his role, an outcome that many, including Samantha's father, found difficult to accept. At the heart of the tragedy was Denton Ritchie, Samantha's father. A soft-spoken man, an Army Reserve veteran, he had fought quietly for custody of his daughter, only to lose her a week after the courts awarded primary care to her mother. He never missed a child support payment. He never stopped searching when Samantha vanished. And he never stopped grieving. In 2010, after serving 15 years, Therressa Ritchie went before the Ohio Parole Board. Her request was denied. Over 1,000 community members, led by Denton himself, signed a petition urging the board to keep her behind bars. "As long as I'm breathing," he said, "that's where she's going to be." Today, Therressa Jolynn Ritchie remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Her name may not appear often in headlines, but in Dayton, her case left a scar and a question that still echoes. How does a child vanish from her bed and end up buried in silence so close to home? Perhaps the most haunting answer lies not in what was done, but in who failed to stop it. 29. Donna Marie Roberts. In the quiet suburb of Howland Township, Ohio, a phone rang shortly after midnight on December 12, 2001. On the line was 57-year-old Donna Marie Roberts, breathless and panicked. She claimed she had returned home to find her ex-husband, Robert Fingerhut, dead, shot and bleeding on the kitchen floor. Police responded quickly. But what began as a possible home invasion soon unraveled into one of the most calculated and disturbing murder plots in the state's history. Donna Roberts had lived a life of reinvention. Born in Youngstown, Ohio in 1944, she spent decades in Florida working as a surgical assistant, marrying and divorcing multiple times. In 1980, she met Robert Fingerhut. Though divorced for financial reasons, the two continued to live together, managing bus terminals and rental franchises. To the outside world, they still appeared to be husband and wife. But in secret, Roberts had rekindled a passionate relationship with Nathaniel Jackson, an ex-convict serving time for robbery. While Jackson was behind bars, the two exchanged more than 280 letters, many laced with coded language, sexual innuendo, and increasingly talk of eliminating Robert. The motive: insurance. Fingerhut had named Roberts as the sole beneficiary on 2 life policies totaling over $550,000. According to prosecutors, Roberts and Jackson conspired for months. She secured him a hotel room upon his release, bought him gloves and a ski mask, and even gave him access to their shared home. Less than 48 hours after Jackson's release, Robert Fingerhut was dead, shot multiple times after returning from work. Roberts claimed she discovered the body, but investigators quickly noticed inconsistencies. Her emotional reactions felt staged. Her timeline didn't hold. And soon evidence mounted: intercepted phone calls, handwritten letters detailing the plan, and DNA placing Jackson at the scene. Both were arrested within days. Jackson admitted to pulling the trigger, but claimed it was self-defense. Roberts insisted she had no idea of his intentions, but the evidence said otherwise. In 2003, Donna Roberts was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death, becoming the only woman on Ohio's death row. Nathaniel Jackson received the same fate. The case didn't end there. In 2006, the Ohio Supreme Court vacated Roberts's death sentence not because of doubt over her guilt, but due to a procedural error. The trial judge had allowed prosecutors to draft parts of the sentencing opinion. She was resentenced in 2008. The outcome remained the same. Today, Donna Roberts is incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville, awaiting execution. Her appeals continue, but her place in history is already sealed. A calculated betrayal, a lover's plot, and a man murdered in his own home by those he trusted most. As one prosecutor put it, she provided the means and the motive. He pulled the trigger. But this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a plan signed, sealed, and delivered. 30. Marlene Smith. In December 1997, 29-year-old Anthony Proviano, a bright, compassionate medical student from Pennsylvania, vanished on his way home for Christmas. He never made it. 4 days later, his body was found in the brush behind a motel in St. Clairsville, Ohio. The cause of death, a single gunshot wound. But what initially looked like a tragic suicide would unravel into a tangled case of deception, missteps, and a haunting confession that came too late. At the center of this story was Marlene Smith, known on the streets as Slim. Smith was born in 1956. By the late 1990s, she was known in parts of Ohio and Pennsylvania for her criminal past, including drug use, sex work, and petty theft. She lived on the fringes, often surviving through manipulation and quick cons. Those who knew her said she could be charismatic when it suited her, but behind the charm was volatility and silence. After Proviano's death was hastily ruled a suicide, his family refused to accept the verdict. His wallet was still in his pocket. His car was filled with Christmas presents. The hotel room he'd paid for showed no sign of being used. A single set of footprints led to the scene. Still, no autopsy was ordered. The official ruling slowed the investigation, but didn't stop it. It took nearly 7 years and pressure from 2 states for the truth to emerge. In 2004, a jailhouse informant claimed Smith and her husband, Douglas Maine, had lured Proviano into a trap, a promise of drugs and sex that ended in robbery and murder. Another witness claimed Smith herself admitted hitting him, then shooting him with his own pistol. These weren't just rumors, they were confessions captured on tape and in letters. Despite a lack of physical evidence, Smith was arrested in October 2004. Maine's charges were later dismissed due to a violation of his right to a speedy trial. But Smith's case moved forward. During her 2006 trial, witnesses, some former cellmates, others from her past, testified that she'd boasted about the killing. One remembered her calling Proviano a trick that went bad. The most damning evidence came from her own voice, unknowingly recorded during a voicemail left for a detective. In the background, she screamed during an argument, "I'm a murderer! You hear that? I'm a murderer!" The jury deliberated for a day and a half before convicting Marlene Slim Smith of murder and a firearm specification. She was sentenced to 18.5 years to life. The judge called her the personification of evil. She showed no emotion as the sentence was read and never spoke on her own behalf. Smith served less than 4 years of her sentence. In 2009, she died of cancer at age 53 while incarcerated. She took many answers with her. To this day, Anthony Proviano's family believes there are still pieces missing, questions left unasked or never answered. But one thing is certain: without their persistence, justice might never have come, and Slim's secrets might have stayed buried like the body behind that motel. 31. Della Dante Sutorius. It was the morning of February 19th, when Dr. Daryl Sutorius, a respected heart surgeon, missed his rounds. Concerned colleagues called police. Hours later, his body was found in the basement of his upscale Cincinnati home, a single gunshot wound to the head. His wife, Della Sutorius, said she had no idea he was even home. She suggested suicide. But police weren't convinced. And soon, neither was anyone else. Born Della Faye Hall in 1950, Della had been married and divorced 4 times before she met Dr. Sutorius through a dating service. To those around her, she was energetic, charming, and strikingly self-assured. But behind her carefully crafted image, there was a history of volatility, multiple former husbands who recalled veiled threats, manipulation, and a fixation on wealth. Dr. Sutorius had fallen hard. He showered her with gifts, and the couple married quickly. To outsiders, they lived a life of luxury dinners, travel, fine clothes. But behind closed doors, the marriage was unraveling. Financial stress mounted. Della clashed with his adult daughter. The couple began seeing a marriage counselor. Daryl, it was later revealed, had quietly consulted a divorce attorney. 7 days after the murder, the case shifted dramatically. Police discovered that Della had purchased the .25 caliber pistol found near her husband's body just 2 days before his death. Gunshot residue tests pointed to her as the shooter. An autopsy ruled out suicide, and her story no longer held up. Then came the past. One ex-husband said he'd found knives hidden around the house. Another recalled her telling him plainly, "I could kill you." A former boyfriend said she once waved a gun in his direction. The pattern was clear. When Della felt rejected, she lashed out. Prosecutors argued this time she wasn't just angry, she was calculating. Dr. Sutorius had a $1 million pension plan and a house full of valuables. If he left her, she'd lose everything. At trial, Della didn't take the stand. Her attorneys claimed Daryl had died by suicide and questioned the legality of the evidence. But jurors weren't swayed. After less than 5 hours of deliberation, they found her guilty of aggravated murder plus firearm and drug charges. She was sentenced to 23 years to life in prison. The public dubbed her the Black Widow. Media coverage swirled. Her trial was televised. Talk shows competed for interviews with her former lovers. A courtroom drama lived out in real time. Della appealed, but the courts upheld her conviction, citing overwhelming evidence. She served her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. On November 20, 2010, at the age of 60, she died of natural causes in prison. She would have been eligible for parole just 3 years later. To this day, Della Sutorius remains a cautionary figure, her story a blend of charm, manipulation, and ultimately, violence. A woman who built a life through deception and lost everything in the pursuit of control. 32. Shey L. Weicker. On the night of May 26, 2014, a quiet street in Fostoria, Ohio erupted into chaos. Flames consumed a modest home on South Poplar Street. Inside were 3 residents, 2 of them deaf, 1 partially blind. By the time first responders arrived, the fire had claimed 2 lives and left 1 survivor clinging to life. The arsonist had already vanished into the dark. But her motive would ignite a case as volatile as the fire itself. Shey L. Weicker, 32 years old, had a complicated past. Known locally for a long trail of minor offenses, she was a mother, a girlfriend, and a woman fueled by a fierce protectiveness, perhaps a misdirected one. In interviews, she would later claim her actions were driven by a belief that one of the victims, Danny Joe Marker Jr., had harmed her son. But that belief, whether real or imagined, sparked a decision that turned deadly. That night, Weicker approached the home and lit a railroad flare, then threw it at the porch. The fire spread fast, blocking exits and trapping the occupants inside. Danny Marker, 48, and Tara Lynn Vance, 44, didn't make it out. A third resident, Dana Weatherall, survived but with serious injuries. All three victims were hearing impaired. One was partially blind. The odds were already against them. Police quickly identified Weicker as a suspect. She was arrested the same day. During questioning, she broke down. She claimed she hadn't meant to kill anyone. She just wanted to send a message to keep Marker away from her family. But investigators saw something else. A premeditated act based on an accusation that had never been substantiated in court. And it wasn't just Weicker. Two other individuals, Charles Schaefer and Timothy Hall, were also charged for their roles in helping plan or cover up the crime. Faced with mounting evidence, Weicker pleaded guilty. She accepted responsibility for aggravated arson, aggravated murder, and attempted murder. In September 2014, she stood before a judge sobbing as she apologized to the victims' families. "I didn't mean to kill anybody," she said. "I just wanted to make my point." The court sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. She is currently serving that sentence at an Ohio correctional facility. Her children, young and now separated from their mother, are among those left to carry the emotional burden. The victims' families, meanwhile, relive those early morning hours each day. They remember the phone calls, the screams, the smoke. They mourn not just the lives lost, but the silence that followed, a silence louder than any words of remorse. Shey Weicker's case is a reminder of how dangerous it can be when anger is weaponized and justice is sought through personal vengeance rather than due process. Whatever her beliefs were that night, they ended with irreversible consequences for her and for the lives consumed by the fire. 33. Velma West. In the quiet town of Perry, Ohio, nestled among the orderly nurseries and close-knit traditions, a young bride named Velma West arrived like a spark in dry tinder. At just 21, she had the style of a city flapper, the voice of jazz, and the restlessness of someone born a few decades too soon. Velma Van Wert. West was not like the others. She smoked in public, wore her hair bobbed, and spoke her mind without apology. To her in-laws and neighbors, she was an outsider more interested in Cleveland's nightlife than in Perry's gentle rhythms. Her husband, Edward West, came from a prominent family, one known across the country for its thriving horticulture business. He was quiet, hard-working, and deeply rooted in the town's traditions. Velma, on the other hand, was restless. Their marriage, barely 2 years old, had turned cold. Velma spent more time in the city than at home. Edward, exhausted from long days in the fields, preferred quiet evenings. But Velma wanted music, parties, light, life. On December 6, 1927, everything unraveled. After yet another argument over a party Velma refused to miss, she later confessed she saw red. She retrieved a hammer from the basement and struck Edward in a moment of rage. When the dust settled, she didn't cry. Instead, she changed clothes, drove 35 miles to a friend's home in Cleveland, and won prizes at a bridge party. She sang, laughed, and slept peacefully. The next morning, she went Christmas shopping for her murdered husband. The police found her calm, even cooperative. When asked a simple question about the back door being left open, Velma offered a full confession. Her behavior bewildered investigators. She was composed, detached, almost theatrical. The press quickly dubbed her the modern murderess and a nightclub girl in a curfew town. Her trial never reached a jury. On March 5, 1928, Velma West pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison and sent to the Marysville Women's Reformatory. There she faded from headlines, but not from memory. Velma's prison years were marked by transformation and controversy. Once a rebellious inmate, she eventually earned a reputation as a model prisoner. But in 1939, she escaped, seeking, in her own words, one little adventure in this dull life of mine. She was recaptured, but the escape cost her a possible parole. In later letters, she wrote of pain, regret, and the desire for a life she never quite found. She would remain behind bars for over 3 decades. Parole was denied time and again. By 1959, her health had deteriorated. Velma West died of heart failure in the same reformatory where she had entered as a young woman. She was 52. Her legacy is complex, both a tragic emblem of the Roaring Twenties and a cautionary tale of resentment, impulse, and isolation. In the end, Velma West wasn't remembered for her fashion or her flippancy, but for a single moment that shattered 2 lives and the illusion that charm can conceal the storm beneath. 34. Martha Wise. In the quiet farmland of Medina County, Ohio, the rhythms of life rarely changed. Families worked the soil, neighbors knew one another, and funerals marked time as solemn rituals. But in the mid-1920s, that peace shattered one funeral at a time. At the center of the storm stood a widow with a strange obsession, a string of poisoned relatives, and a name that would echo through true crime history: Martha Wise. By 1924, Martha was 40 years old, poor, widowed, and restless. Her husband, Albert Wise, had died suddenly the year before, leaving her with 4 children and a reputation for odd behavior. She had always been different. Her neighbors whispered about her compulsion to attend every funeral within walking distance. She didn't just observe, she wept loudly, even when she hadn't known the deceased. And then she met Walter Johns. Younger and local Johns offered Martha the attention she craved. But their relationship was scorned by her family. Her mother, Sophie Hazel, and her aunt Lily Ginka made it clear the affair had to end. They believed it improper, embarrassing, shameful. Under pressure, Martha broke things off with Walter, but the resentment took root. That Thanksgiving, 1924, Sophie fell ill after dinner. Others recovered quickly, but Sophie lingered, then died. Her cause of death was listed as stomach inflammation. Weeks later, on New Year's Eve, Martha's aunt and uncle Lily and Fred Ginka also fell sick. This time it wasn't just 2 people. Several family members collapsed. Lily and Fred died within weeks. 4 of their children were left partially paralyzed. 17 relatives would fall ill before the pattern was clear. The cause was poison. Arsenic administered in water buckets and coffee pots, food and drink. And all the signs pointed to Martha. When Sheriff Fred Rochon brought her in for questioning, Martha denied everything. But it was a quiet moment. A tap of rain on the jailhouse roof that broke her. The sheriff's wife whispered, "The rain. It's the voice of God. It says, you did. You did." Martha crumbled. "Yes," she sobbed. "I did it. The devil told me to." She confessed to poisoning 17 people. 3 had died. She also admitted to setting fires around town because she said she liked the flames. They were red and bright. Her trial began in May 1925. Her defense pleaded insanity. She claimed the devil had followed her, whispering in her ear while she baked bread, while she worked the fields. Walter Johns, the man at the center of it all, was called as a witness. He denied any romantic ties and said he pitied her more than loved her. After just 1 hour of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. First-degree murder, but with a recommendation for mercy. Martha Wise was sentenced to life in prison. She served 37 years quietly. In 1962, she was paroled at age 79, but the world had no place for her. Her family refused to take her in. No nursing home would accept her. After just 3 days, she returned to Marysville Women's Reformatory, where she would live out the rest of her days. On June 28, 1971, Martha Wise died behind prison walls. She had once said she loved funerals. In the end, she waited decades for one more. Her own, 35. Mary Ann Wittich. On a quiet street in Deli Township, Ohio, life moved with the comforting rhythm of routine. Kids played in backyards, neighbors waved politely, and houses stood in tidy rows, secure, familiar, peaceful. But on July 31, 2007, that illusion shattered. Mary Ann Wittich, known to friends as Mimi, was a 44-year-old mother of 4, a recent nursing school graduate, and a youth soccer coach. To many, she was a doting mom balancing life after a long marriage and a fresh divorce. But underneath that image was a woman unraveling. She had been married for 24 years. By the summer of 2007, her husband John Scott Wittich had moved out. Their divorce had been finalized just weeks earlier. The custody of their 2 youngest children, Jacob, chapter 10, and Sydney, 7, was to be shared. Outwardly, the arrangement seemed civil. But behind closed doors, Mary Ann was spiraling. In the days leading up to July 31st, the signs were subtle but telling. Friends and family described dramatic mood swings, erratic behavior, and a deepening depression. She spoke of feeling lost, hinted at despair, and in one instance even alluded to jumping from a bridge. Yet nothing prepared anyone for what she would do next. That morning, Mary Ann paid a visit to her boyfriend, Michael Clark, waking him early. He described her demeanor as unusually calm, eerily so. She left shortly after sunrise and returned to her suburban home where her 2 youngest children were just starting their day. She picked up lunch at Wendy's chicken nuggets, fries, and an energy drink, then went home to eat with Jacob and Sydney. The television played the Disney Channel. A video game was paused in the living room. It was an ordinary afternoon. Until it wasn't. What happened next was both calculated and chilling. Investigators believe Mary Ann gave her children high doses of Benadryl to make them drowsy. As a trained nurse, she then used a stethoscope to locate their hearts. With a black marker, she drew an X over each child's chest. Then, using a .25 caliber handgun, she shot both Jacob and Sydney twice in the chest as they lay in bed. Finally, she turned the gun on herself. Later that afternoon, her daughter Lindsay returned home and made the grim discovery. Her father Scott had been calling throughout the day 8 times with no answer. He was supposed to pick up the children. Instead, he arrived at a house frozen in grief. Mary Ann left behind notes, messages to family members, a brief letter to her boyfriend, and one envelope atop the bedroom dresser. None offered clear answers. Theories emerged: mental illness, vengeance, fear of losing her children, but no justification could ever explain what happened in that home. Hamilton County Coroner Odell Owens called it one of the most disturbing scenes he had ever witnessed. He later remarked, "Oftentimes, suicides are punishment." You can read between the lines. The tragedy of Mary Ann Wittich is not just the story of a crime. It's the story of how invisible pain, if left unspoken and untreated, can turn into something unimaginable. A devastating reminder that behind even the calmest faces, there can be storms no one sees until it's far too late.